Sarah Wilson woke up that day feeling uneasy, a feeling that was difficult to explain. She had slept poorly, her mind filled with thoughts that weren't organized, and yet she got up early as she always did. At 70, she still maintained the routine of a woman who built everything with effort and never allowed others to decide for her. Widowed for 15 years, she had learned to walk alone and to maintain her independence like a shield. While she prepared a simple coffee in her kitchen, she mentally replayed the retirement party that her son, Michael, and daughter-in-law, Jessica, had organized. The house was immaculate, fresh flowers in vases, a freshly ironed tablecloth, family portraits lined up on the mantelpiece. Everything seemed in order, but inside her there was a tension she couldn't hide. It wasn't fear, it was that old feeling she had learned to listen for when something wasn't right. As the guests arrived, the atmosphere filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations mingled in a constant murmur. Jessica bustled around with exaggerated energy, greeting everyone with an enthusiasm that was unlike her. Sarah noticed it immediately. That overly calculated friendliness, that insistence on controlling every detail, especially when it came to the bottles and glasses. It wasn't simply a hostess's zeal. There was something more to that need to have everything in her hands. Sarah watched silently, without losing her composure. When Jessica leaned over, the glass meant for her. The gesture was subtle but obvious to someone with a trained eye. The hidden hand, the quick movement, the slight change in the drink's scent. Sarah didn't react, didn't raise her voice, or make a fuss. She just retained the exact memory of what she had just witnessed and took a breath, knowing she would have to act with the same coldness she had used so many times in business. Sarah didn't make any abrupt gestures. She simply left her glass in the same place, feigning indifference while continuing to chat with a group of former colleagues who had come to greet her. When she felt no one was watching, she discreetly switched glasses for the one next to them, meant for Helen, Jessica's mother. The exchange was so natural that no one noticed. Inside, Sarah experienced a mixture of tension and calm. Tension from confirming what she suspected, and calm because she had taken control of the situation without arousing suspicion. Minutes later, when Helen drank from the wrong glass, the reaction was immediate. Her face turned pale, she began to sweat, and she had to sit down quickly before anyone noticed she couldn't breathe properly. The music continued to play, the guests were laughing, but Sarah already knew that this moment was going to change everything. The commotion quickly erupted. An ambulance was called, and within minutes the room was an organized chaos of worried people, hurried questions, and nervous murmurs. Helen was taken to the hospital in critical condition, and Jessica, far from appearing calm, displayed a nervousness that Sarah didn't miss. Her daughter-in-law's eyes darted from side to side, searching for Michael, who tried to appear controlled but couldn't hide his discomfort either. Amid the confusion, Sarah stood, observing every detail as if she were attending a crucial business meeting. She didn't need material proof at that moment. The reactions, the silences, that knowing glance Michael gave Jessica when he thought no. One was looking were enough. It was silent confirmation that the betrayal was underway and that she had been the target. At the hospital, the atmosphere was different. The smell of disinfectant, the cold lights, and the murmur of hurried footsteps created a stark contrast with the celebration that had been left behind. Sarah sat in a corner of the waiting room, seemingly calm, but with her mind analyzing every detail. Jessica paced back and forth, talking softly on the phone, her tone more irritated than concerned. Michael, on the other hand, clumsily tried to comfort her, but his gaze avoided meeting his mother's. It was in that awkward silence that Sarah finally understood what was really happening. This was no accident or unfortunate coincidence. It was a premeditated plan, designed to throw her off track. The confirmation came to her like a sharp blow, without the need for words. Michael and Jessica were drowning in debt. She'd known it for a long time, and they'd always found ways to ask her for money disguised as favors or family investments. This time they'd gone further. They saw her fortune as an early inheritance, a bounty that was rightfully theirs, simply because they bore her last name. The image of the tampered glass coupled with their visible nervousness, left no room for doubt. Sarah, even with her heart racing, felt this wasn't the time to confront, but to observe. She remained silent, recording each gesture as invisible evidence that could later save her life. That night, back home, Sarah reviewed every second with a clarity that was painful. She sat at her desk, opened a notebook where she usually recorded pending work, and briefly wrote down the essentials. Attempted poisoning, drink, Jessica, Michael accomplice. She was aware that with age, memory could become fragile, and she wasn't about to allow anyone to distort what had happened. The silence of the house contrasted sharply with the bustle of the party, but in that silence, Sarah found the strength to devise a plan. She wasn't going to fall for provocations or give them the pleasure of seeing her vulnerable. Instead, she would use the same skills that had allowed her to build a fortune from scratch: patience, strategy, and coolness. The next day, she received the first sign of pressure. Michael appeared with a rehearsed speech, telling her about the perks of moving to a luxury residence called Sunset Manor. He painted a picture of a comfortable future with top-notch medical services, social activities, and the promise that she would be better cared for there than alone at home. Sarah listened without interruption, recognizing every word as part of a larger manipulation. The detail that alerted her was the figure: a down payment of $400,000. It wasn't an innocent suggestion, it was a calculated move to empty her account. Sarah smiled serenely, gave him an ambiguous answer, and let him go, while inwardly confirming that her son's game had only just begun. The pressure soon mounted. Jessica began calling her almost daily, using a sweet tone that belied her usual harshness. She spoke of the peace of mind she would feel signing certain documents, how she would free Michael from financial worries, and how fair it would be to entrust them with the management of his estate. Sarah, who had dealt with unscrupulous executives and manipulative clients in her career, recognized every word as part of a learned script. Most disturbing was discovering through an acquaintance that Michael had contacted a geriatric psychiatrist known for drafting mental incapacity reports upon request. It was a low blow, an attempt to legally invalidate her to justify the transfer of her assets. The discovery that finally confirmed her suspicions came with a seemingly minor detail: a $500,000 life insurance policy taken out in her name, with Jessica as the sole beneficiary. She obtained that information thanks to a lawyer friend who reviewed the records without raising suspicions. At that moment, Sarah knew it was no longer just manipulation or greed, but a scheme that combined fraud, psychological pressure, and the clear intention of getting her out of the way. For the first time in a long time, she felt a chill run down her spine, not out of fear, but out of the certainty that she was facing her own flesh and blood as if they were sworn enemies. It pained her to accept that reality, but at the same time it gave her clarity. The time had come to fight back. Sarah met with her trusted lawyer, someone who had been with her for years on her company's most important transactions. With him, she restructured her entire estate. She transferred assets to funds that were impossible to manipulate, updated her will, and secured each property with clauses that prevented its sale without express authorization. She left no stone unturned. Meanwhile, she hired a private investigator to follow Michael and Jessica's every step. The result was a detailed report that confirmed what she already suspected: millions in debt accumulated on credit cards, personal loans, and a life of luxury sustained only by appearances. All of this was the driving force behind the urgency with which they wanted access to her money. Armed with the information, Sarah devised a strategy that seemed straight out of her most active years as a businesswoman. She pretended to give in to the pressure. She accepted the idea of moving to Sunset Manor and showed a willingness to sign the required power of attorney. At the same time, she worked with her lawyer and the police to set a trap that would expose the couple's every intention. She knew Michael and Jessica would let their guard down as soon as they believed they had control. This apparent surrender wasn't weakness, it was cold calculation. Every word, every kind gesture was part of a carefully planned scenario. Sarah was prepared to wait for just the right moment for her own children to be caught in the web they themselves had woven. The day of the supposed signing arrived. Michael and Jessica appeared punctually, with broad smiles that attempted to hide their anxiety. They had brought the prepared documents, confident that their plan was coming to fruition. Sarah greeted them calmly, offered them coffee, and acted with the serenity of someone feigning resignation. She pretended to have doubts, asked a few irrelevant questions, and finally took up the pen to sign the sheets placed before them. For the couple, that moment was the triumph they had long awaited. They didn't know that those pages were copies designed by their lawyer, worthless papers that only granted them control over a bank account containing a single dollar. Sarah, without showing any emotion, handed them the folder with the delicacy of a mother trusting her children. Hours later, as Michael and Jessica were celebrating their victory, the police stormed their home with a clear warrant and overwhelming evidence. The private investigator had documented Jessica tampering with the glass at the party, in addition to tracking the insurance policy and suspicious financial transactions. The scene was chaotic. Jessica tried to defend herself with hysterical screams. Michael froze, and Sarah, in the midst of it all, stood firm, watching as the truth came out. It was painful, yes, because they were her own flesh and blood, but at the same time, it was an act of justice. The betrayal was no longer a matter of suspicion. It had become an obvious crime with consequences that no one could avoid. The trial moved quickly. Jessica was formally charged with attempted murder and fraud, while Michael faced conspiracy charges. During the hearings, the evidence was so clear that their lawyers could barely muster a defense. Sarah sat through each session in silence, her face serene but her heart heavy. It wasn't easy listening to her own son's schemes being outlined, how he was portrayed as a man, willing to sacrifice his mother for money. Still, she stood firm, convinced that to look the other way would have condemned herself to a life of vulnerability and fear. The sentence came after weeks of tension. Jessica received 15 years in prison, with no immediate reduction possible, while Michael was sentenced to 3 years for complicity. The hardest blow was seeing her son handcuffed, unable to look her in the eye as he was escorted from the courtroom. Sarah didn't cry in public, but in the solitude of her home, she allowed herself to feel that mixture of grief and relief. She had lost a son in life, but she had regained her security and dignity. The price was high, but she knew she had done the right thing. It wasn't just about money, but about defending the life she had worked so hard to build. Amidst this painful panorama, there was an unexpected respite. Emma, Michael, and Jessica's teenage daughter decided to reach out to her grandmother. With tears in her eyes, she confessed that she had always felt the tension in her home, that she sensed the arguments about money, and that she never understood why her parents seemed to envy Sarah's accomplishments. For Sarah, this rapprochement was a ray of hope. They began to share quiet evenings cooking together and talking about simple things, as if a new bond had been woven in these small routines that neither betrayal nor judgment could break. Another surprise was the relationship she began to forge with Helen, Jessica's mother. Although she had been an unwitting victim of the scheme, Helen was willing to talk and acknowledge the shame of having a daughter capable of going to such lengths. A friendship grew between them based on sincerity and empathy for having been used. They met several times after the hospital, sharing coffee and long conversations, almost as if consoling each other for the children who had let them down. Sarah discovered that, even amid the most bitter betrayal, it was possible to find genuine connections and support in unexpected places. As the months passed, Sarah's life resumed a different rhythm, more serene but still full of important decisions. She reorganized her assets once again, ensuring that everything was allocated to causes she considered worthy, and above all protected from greedy hands. Despite her age, she didn't lose her strategic nature or her daily discipline. She reviewed documents, held meetings with her lawyer, and planned investments with the same. Mental clarity as always. This routine, far from exhausting her, kept her alive, and with the certainty that independence has no expiration date. On more than one occasion, she reflected on what had happened. It wasn't just about having unmasked an attempted murder. or having escaped a financial conspiracy. What marked her most was seeing how far ambition and ingratitude could go within a family. And at the same time, she clung to what she had gained, the sincere affection of her granddaughter. Emma, the unexpected friendship with Helen, and above all, the certainty that she had been able to protect her life and dignity no matter how old she was. Sarah understood that true power lay not in the millions she had accumulated, but in the strength that allowed her to defend herself when everyone expected her to surrender. On Emma's high school graduation day, Sarah attended wearing a simple navy blue dress and the same pendant she'd worn at the party where it all began, watching her walk. Toward the stage, she felt the wound of betrayal heal a little more. She had lost a son, yes, but she had gained the trust and affection of a granddaughter who looked up to her with genuine admiration. In the applause of the audience, Sarah sensed that not everything was broken, that true bonds remained that could give meaning to her final years. That night, returning home, she sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and looked around. At the walls, the portraits, the memories of a lifetime. She thought of Michael and Jessica, now separated by bars and their own choices, and how ambition had consumed what could have been a relationship of love and respect. Then she thought of herself, how she had endured without letting age define her strength. It's not age that determines what one can or cannot do, she told herself silently. She was living proof that, even in the twilight of life, dignity and courage remain powerful weapons. A few days after the trial, Sarah welcomed the private investigator into her home to finalize the work they had begun months earlier. The man handed her a thick folder containing copies of bank statements, photographs of suspicious meetings between Michael and lenders, and recordings of Jessica arguing with him about the early inheritance. Sarah calmly flipped through each document, taking notes in the margins, as she often did in her consulting days. This wasn't just a matter of legal evidence. It was confirmation that she hadn't been mistaken in trusting her intuition. That file became a silent symbol of her victory, something she locked away in a safe not out of judicial necessity, but as a personal reminder that she had strategically confronted the lie. With that certainty, she began to slowly rebuild her routine. In the mornings, she checked her investments, walked through the garden she'd neglected in the process, and made her own breakfast, as she always had. The difference lay in the feeling of absolute control over her life, something no son or daughter-in-law could ever take away from her again. When Emma visited her after school, they shared long conversations in the kitchen. Sarah taught her recipes her mother had never wanted to learn, and in those small gestures, she found the emotional healing she so desperately needed. She knew that the bond with her granddaughter didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it transformed it into something more bearable, giving her a new purpose for her days. The bond with Helen also grew little by little. At first, these were sporadic, almost formal encounters, in which both shared the discomfort of having been used by the same person. But over time, these meetings turned into sincere conversations, where they could talk about their fears, the disappointment in their children, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanied old age. Helen, with her reserved nature, found in Sarah someone who understood her pain without judging her, and Sarah, accustomed to solving everything on her own, discovered that she could open up and accept company without feeling like she was losing her independence. It was an unexpected but necessary friendship. Meanwhile, Sarah remained cautious. She frequently checked her financial security, updated passwords, and maintained constant contact with her lawyer. She didn't do this out of paranoia, but because she understood that, after experiencing such an elaborate attempt at manipulation and harm, trust must be built with actions, not words. Still, she didn't wallow in resentment. On the contrary, she began attending small community talks where she shared her experience with other older adults. There, over coffee and folding chairs, she recounted how she had faced her own family's betrayal and how she had managed to maintain her autonomy. Many approached her at the end to thank her, confessing that they too experienced similar pressures in silence. One afternoon at the community center, Sarah heard an older woman tell how her own son was trying to convince her to sell the family home and move to a small apartment. This story shook her because it was almost a reflection of what she herself had experienced. In a firm voice, Sarah told her not to rush, to seek legal advice before signing anything, and to never doubt her own judgment, no matter how much others tried to make her feel incapable. That simple remark sparked spontaneous applause in the room, and for the first time, Sarah understood that her testimony could serve beyond her inner circle. It could be a guide for those who were still hesitant to defend themselves. This new facet of life gave her renewed energy. She began receiving calls from neighbors and acquaintances asking for advice, not about investments or business, but about how to maintain dignity in the face of abusive or self-serving family members. Although she never sought to become a role model, Sarah welcomed these conversations because she knew what it meant to feel cornered by those who should be providing support. Every time she hung up the phone after listening to someone, she took a deep breath and thought, "If I could get ahead, they can too." That certainty became a silent driving force that kept her going, beyond money or the trials she'd overcome. With Emma, the relationship grew increasingly close. The teenager found in her grandmother a refuge from the tense atmosphere of her home, marked by the judicial scandal and the absence of her parents. Sarah offered her stability, a space where she could speak without fear and feel heard. They would spend entire afternoons looking through old albums where Emma would discover photographs of her grandfather and her father's childhood. These moments were difficult for both of them because the shadow of betrayal was always present, but they also became an opportunity for learning. Sarah spoke to her about the importance of honesty and the value of independence, trying to teach her lessons that would transcend the family wounds. It wasn't easy for Sarah to take on the role of guide after so much pain, but she did so patiently. When Emma asked her for help with her studies, she once again felt the satisfaction of sharing knowledge, just as she had in her days as a consultant, but this time from a much more human perspective. They cooked together, shared their silences, and little by little built a bond based on trust and respect. On more than one occasion, Emma confessed that she wanted to be more like her than like her own parents, and those words resonated deeply with Sarah, who understood that life was giving her back, through her granddaughter, some of what she had lost. Over time, Sarah began to regain calm in her own home as well. She returned to enjoying the small rituals she had abandoned during the storm, reading the newspaper with a cup of tea on the terrace, tending her plants in the mornings, and calling old friends to pick up the pieces. Every detail was a reminder that she was still in control of her life, and that no conspiracy, however elaborate, had managed to break her spirit. She wasn't naive. She knew the emotional scars would remain, but she also understood that those marks were part of the strength that now defined her. Once, while filing documents in her study, she came across the forged copies of the attorney's office she had given Michael. Holding those papers in her hands provoked a strange feeling, a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness because they symbolized the point of no return with her son, and pride because they represented the cleverness that allowed her to protect herself. She filed them away again, this time in a folder marked "Overcome." For Sarah, it wasn't about reliving the pain, but rather reminding herself that she had had the courage to face it and move forward. It was a silent way of closing the circle without relinquishing her memory. With the arrival of spring, Sarah decided to open her home to small gatherings with lifelong friends. She organized simple snacks in the garden, with coffee, homemade cakes, and long conversations that restored her sense of belonging. Many of these women had followed the court case closely, albeit from a distance, and they continued to express their admiration for the fortitude with which she had faced everything. Sarah, however, always responded humbly. "I had no choice. It had to be done." She wasn't looking for recognition. She only valued being able to share genuine moments with people who expected nothing from her other than companionship. Emma also took part in these gatherings, and little by little, she became a regular presence in her grandmother's social life. She loved hearing stories from the past, asking about what it was like to grow up in another era, and often took notes for school projects. Sarah, seeing her so interested, felt she was passing on more than anecdotes. She was leaving an emotional and cultural legacy that no fortune could match. This dynamic further strengthened their bond and gave Sarah the certainty that despite the losses, she still played an important role in the lives of those around her. At the same time, Sarah began collaborating with a local foundation that offered free legal advice to senior citizens. Her personal experience became a valuable tool in raising awareness about the risks of family and financial manipulation. Every time she told her story, she saw the same mix of surprise and recognition on the audience's faces. Many realized they weren't alone in these silent battles. Although she never imagined becoming a community leader, she embraced the role naturally, convinced that sharing what she'd learned could save others from falling into similar traps. It was in this way that, without seeking it, Sarah discovered a new purpose. What had initially been a devastating episode in her life ended up transforming into a platform to inspire and protect others. She didn't consider herself a hero, but rather someone who had refused to be a victim. That distinction was fundamental to her. When she returned home after those talks, she felt lighter, as if each shared word was also a way to heal. And in the silence of her living room, surrounded by family photographs that no longer hurt as much, she realized that she had managed to turn betrayal into strength and pain into a legacy. A year after everything that had happened, Sarah found herself enjoying a peace she'd thought impossible. At the time of the holiday, she'd regained calm in her home, decorating some spaces with new colors and treating herself to small luxuries like a comfortable armchair or a used piano she'd always wanted to play again. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but these gestures were a way of reminding herself that she could still build joy into her everyday life. Every morning she woke up energized, reviewed her financial affairs, and then devoted time to what gave her the most pleasure: cultivating her garden, reading historical novels, and greeting Emma with a smile when she came home from school. Her granddaughter's constant presence gave Sarah renewed motivation. Together they took short trips to nearby towns, visited museums, and even started a small volunteer project at an animal shelter. Sarah saw a special sparkle in Emma's eyes, as if all that time together was showing her a different path than her parents. And although she knew she couldn't erase the young woman's wounds, she felt she could offer her a different example, that of a woman who, despite betrayal, remained steadfast and found new reasons to get up every day. Last Christmas, Sarah decided to open her home again for an intimate dinner. There were no grand displays or ostentatious decorations, just a well-set table, a simple tree, and the people who truly mattered: Emma, Helen, and a couple of close friends. Throughout the evening, Sarah raised her glass, this time with absolute confidence, and toasted life, resilience, and the possibility of starting over at any age. She didn't speak of betrayals or judgments, only of gratitude for what she still had, and in that moment, she felt the wound had finally healed. As she went to bed that night, she reviewed everything that had happened since the day she discovered Jessica's hand on her glass. She remembered the initial fear, the quiet rage, the careful strategy, and above all, the strength she had found within herself to endure. Now, at 70, she knew that it wasn't age that defined fragility or strength, but rather the ability to resist giving up when life seemed to be falling apart. She closed her eyes serenely, convinced that she had saved much more than her assets. She had saved her dignity, her independence, and the confidence that she was still the master of her destiny.